Hello, eSchool Cambodia students. Welcome back to new Interchange intro book, unit number 5. And we're on page 29, and we're on exercise number 3, snapshot. Remember, snapshot means a photograph, the picture. They want to show us a big picture to help us understand about something, to summarize about something. And so the snapshot, and what do you see there? You see a map of the world, and the map of the world, it says time zones. And so you see at the top A, B, C, D, 3X through X. At the bottom you see -11, -10, -9, we can say negative, or we can say -8, -7, -6, all the way to 0. And then we see +1, +2, +3. And so many years ago in the 1800s, people who traveled the earth, people who sailed in ships, people who traveled on trains, there were no airplanes at that time, but people who traveled across the world from Europe, they traveled to America, they traveled from Asia to Europe, and they would travel and they would want to communicate with one another. There was no telephone at that time, but I believe they had telegraph, so they had a way of communicating, and they wanted to make plans. They said, I will be there and meet you at this time on this day. But the time was all crazy. The time in every country was different back in those days. And so they had different times for different countries according to what every country wanted. And so according to their history, according to their tradition, according to their religion. And so during about 50 years or more, people who travel started to get the idea, we need to fix this problem. We need to create consistency. 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 So there's consistent means something that is consistent is something that is the same. They said it's changed, it's different all over the world, and it's really confusing for us to try to make plans and to try to communicate with people in other countries. This was especially a problem with trains in the United States. Now the United States is very big. It's about 5,000 kilometers from the east coast of the United States to the west of the United States. And so trains would travel, and the time was different in every state. Going across from one side to the United States to the other side, the time was not consistent. And so it was really because of the trains in the United States that someone said, we need to get organized. We need to create consistency in our time. And so eventually, after about 50 years in the United States, and then Europe, and then Australia and Asia, they started to create consistency in the time. So the time was the same in different places, but they created what they called time zones. I'm not going to explain this. It has to do with the earth moving, and has to do with the sun shining on it and all of that. I'm not a scientist. I'm not going to explain that. But they created time zones. And so these lines, this would be called a globe. This is a ball I use for teaching. But pretend that this is the earth. And the earth we call a globe. A globe is something that is round. And so they created imaginary lines that go from the North Pole to the South Pole. Okay? And then they also created imaginary lines that go around. These are called the lines of longitude and the lines of latitude. I'm not going to give you a science lesson today. But the lines of longitude, they created a time zone. Time zone number 1, time zone number 2, time zone number 3. Okay, and so they created 24 of them, 24 time zones. And so the beginning, time zone 0, began near London, England. There's a city called Greenwich. Let me write it down for you. Greenwich, England. And so we call this, it is 0. It's the 0. It's where everything starts. 0. On this side is -1. On this side is +1. -1 hour, +1 hour. If they call this Greenwich Mean Time. It looks like green, but they say it Greenwich Mean Time. Okay, can you see that? It's kind of small, but Greenwich Mean Time is the 0 time. All of the time on the clocks all over the world begin with Greenwich Mean Time, with 0. And then as they go west, they lose an hour. So for example, if it's 12 o'clock in Greenwich, England, as they begin to go west, if they go west, then at 12 o'clock is 11 o'clock here, is 10 o'clock here, 9 a.m. here. But if they go east, 12 o'clock becomes 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock around the globe. And so let's read what we have written here on this slide. A time zone is a region of the globe that observes uniform standard time for legal, commercial, and social purposes. Time zones tend to follow the boundaries of countries and their subdivisions instead of strictly following longitude, because it is convenient for areas in close commercial or other communication to keep the same time. Okay, so let me try to explain that. A time zone is a region of the globe, a region of the world, and there's one time. The longitude lines on the earth are straight. The imaginary lines on the globe are straight, but the time zones are not straight. The time zones are crooked. Usually they follow a country, the boundaries of a country, because the United States has 3 time zones. And so when it's 12 o'clock where I live in the United States, on the other side of the United States, it's 3 p.m. It's 12 noon where I live, my mother lives. In Washington, D.C., it's 3 p.m. And so 3 different time zones in the United States, okay, because it's so big. But many countries that are smaller, the time zone goes around the country according to the border. They don't divide the country so that one city of the country is one time and another city in the same country it's another time. They don't do that. And so we say the time zones, if you look on the time zones, they're not straight, they're crooked. Okay, so I'm going to show you a slide right now, and you can see the time zones of the world, and you can see that the time zones are not exactly straight, but they're crooked and they go around the countries most of the time, not all of the time. And so what this does, it makes it easy for us to know what time it is in one country. If we want to call them or if we want to make an appointment, or if we have some business that we need to do, or we want to meet somebody. So it makes it easy. It calls it a uniform standard time. Uniform means the same. Something that is uniform is consistent. It's uniform, it's the same. So there's a uniform standard time for legal purposes, for commercial business purposes, and for social purposes. So it makes it easy to do business. It makes it easy to do law, things associated with the law, and it makes it easy for fun. If we want to go on vacation someplace in another country, it's easy for us to make our plans. And as it says, time zones tend to follow the boundaries of the countries instead of strictly following the longitude lines on the globe. Okay? And so those are the time zones. And we won't go into the details of how they were created, who created them, but just to know that there are time zones that people have created, that mankind has created, to make consistent time throughout the world. And so Greenwich Mean Time is 0. And so if you look at the chart again, as I said, you look at 0 at the bottom, and so 0 runs up through near London. Greenwich is a city just outside of London. And so let's say, for example, if it's 12 o'clock p.m. on Monday in Greenwich, if you go to the east toward Moscow, it becomes 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. It's maybe 3 o'clock in the afternoon in Moscow. And maybe it's 7 o'clock p.m. in Bangkok. Bangkok and Cambodia have the same time. Bangkok and Cambodia are in the same time zone. And so if you go to Sydney, if it's 12 o'clock, for example, if it's 12 o'clock noon on Monday in Greenwich, England, it would be about 10 o'clock at night in Sydney, Australia, and on it goes. But if you go west, we say if you go east, you gain an hour. If you go west, you lose an hour. And so if it's 12 o'clock noon in Greenwich, England, and if you look at New York City, it might be 7 a.m. in New York City. If it's 12 o'clock noon in Greenwich, that's just an example. And if you go all the way to Los Angeles, it might be 4 a.m. until you go and go and go, and you come back around to 0. But actually, what happens is that there's another line. And so here is Greenwich Mean Time. This is the 0 longitude. We call it 0 longitude on the globe. And so there's Greenwich, England, right up here. This is 0. But on the other side of 0 is 180. On the other side of the world, in the Pacific Ocean, we have another imaginary line. And this is called the International Date Line. You can see that on your screen now. The International Date Line is in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And the day changes. Not only does the time change from 1 hour to 1 hour, but when you cross that line, your day changes. And so if you're in the east, if you're in Cambodia, and you're flying in your airplane to the United States, you leave on Monday and you arrive on Monday. For example, many times I've flown on the airplane from Cambodia. I fly from Cambodia to Taiwan or Korea, and then from Korea I fly to Los Angeles or San Francisco. Sometimes I leave at 5 p.m. on Monday, for example. I leave Cambodia at 5 p.m. on Monday, and I arrive in San Francisco at 4 p.m. on Monday. That's crazy. I leave at 5 p.m. on Monday, but I arrive at 4 p.m. Why? because of a different time zone and because of the international dateline. I gain a day. I gain a day. But when I leave San Francisco in the United States to come back to Cambodia, I cross the international dateline going west and I lose a day. And so if I leave at, for example, at 5 p.m. on Monday, I arrive on Wednesday. I lose a complete day. And so this is not a science lesson, and I'm not going to take time to explain this, but just in this lesson is that there are different time zones. And so right now, if it's 5 p.m. in Cambodia, it's 6 p.m. in Singapore, okay? And so the time changes 1 hour by 1 hour, all right? And so that is the lesson. However, let me show you just one more thing. One more thing before we quit this lesson. Look at your slide now, and there are clocks. Okay, so you can see these are clocks, 8 different clocks. When it's 7 o'clock in New York, it's 4 o'clock in Los Angeles. And it's midnight, it's noon or midnight, it's 12 o'clock in London. It's 3 o'clock in Moscow. It's 1 o'clock in Paris. It's 10 o'clock in Sydney, 9 o'clock in Tokyo, and 8 o'clock in Hong Kong. This is what you notice. You notice on a clock or on a watch, we have 2 hands, okay? We call the long hand of the clock and the short hand of the clock. And it comes up, the long hand and the short hand. The long hand is the minute and the short hand is the hour. All over the world, if the hour changes from 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock, but the minute is always the same. It's always the same minute all around the world. The hour will be different, but the minute, let's see if you look, all of the minutes are the same. The hour is different in all of these clocks, but the minute is the same, except for a place in India, a place in Pakistan, and some of the countries around India. They change it by 30 minutes or 45 minutes according to their need. But so when you look at a clock, you know that the minute here in Cambodia is the same minute in Los Angeles, San Francisco, or Paris, or Tokyo. The hour is different, but the minute is always the same. So that's your lesson today, the snapshot lesson on understanding about time zones and the international dateline and the minute hand of the clock and the hour hand of the clock. Whew. So I'm not a good science teacher, but I hope that gives you an idea of how time is different and the same in some ways all over the world. Okay, so take a rest and we'll move on to the next lesson.